Welcome back to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies series that we have called After War, Before Peace. We began this series immediately after the ceasefire document was signed in November, and since then we have had over a dozen episodes exploring the various facets of the very complex issues that have got to be either resolved or at the very least discussed before we actually get to a path to peace. We began this series with the American diplomat Steven Mann, who was part of the OSCE Minsk Group negotiation process for quite a few years. We are ending this series today with this episode, and our guest today is a veteran of the European Union Diplomatic Service, Ambassador Marc Pierini. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to be a part of this complex conversation. I should say that in your many decades as part of the European Union Diplomatic Service, you were head of the EU delegation and ambassador in Ankara from 2006 to 2011, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Those were the good years, I would like to call them. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, these were the years where we were actually running the accession negotiation of Turkey, which started in October 2005. So when I started in November 2006, it was still good. Of course, there were problems with Cyprus and the non-recognition and so on, but it was still a very dynamic negotiation.
They were very good
until
years.
I left, was still a very dynamic negotiation.
Yeah. We remember those years because also the Turkey-Armenia process, whatever we want to call it, normalization, reconciliation is a bit much, but normalization, those, in fact, if I remember right, those were the years when I met you with Osman Kavala, who then ran Anadolu Kultur and today is sitting in prison for reasons ununderstandable to the rest of us. But they were good years, and since then many things have happened. I'd like to begin this conversation talking about the war, Turkey's involvement, its implications for Turkey, the EU, of course, and then, of course, not forget to mention that we're recording this just a few days after the United States President Biden said genocide and what that may or may not mean for Turkey and its relations in the region. But let's start with the war. And the reason this is important is not just to try to understand it, but in process of understanding, seeing what this means for the path to peace. So the importance of Turkey's participation in a war in which Turkey and Azerbaijan came out quite victorious, what does that mean for Turkey, for Erdogan, for domestic politics?
Well, a few weeks back, I would have said this is another achievement, as described by Ankara, in a very aggressive diplomacy. You can see that in Syria, of course, you could see that in Libya, and of course, Nagorno-Karabakh. Right now, I would be a little more cautious about the meaning. Of course, we know the links between Turkey and Azerbaijan, and we know the legalities of the districts around Nagorno-Karabakh. We know also that Nagorno-Karabakh was never recognized by Armenia. So Turkey has scored points in a military battle for which probably Armenia wasn't prepared. But that's not enough. You have to come to a peace agreement of some sort, and we're not there yet, by far.
For Erdogan's room to maneuver in this morass of complications, its relations with Iran, its relations with Russia, obviously its alliance with Azerbaijan, does he drive domestic politics in this issue, or is there a domestic politics constituency that he needs to listen to?
Well, as you know, since whether we put it back to the June 2015 election where the HDP, the Kurdish party, came as a second opposition party, or we put it back to 2018, the alliance between AKP and MHP, the Nationalist Party. Turkish politics are driven by a much more nationalist sentiment than a few years back. Therefore, if you look at, for example, the reactions of Devlet Bahçeli, the chairman of MHP, to Joe Biden's statement on Armenia Remembrance Day, well, you're fully into typical nationalistic narrative. A Turk only has a Turk as a friend, he said yesterday. So that is a very important driver in Turkish domestic politics, especially as the AKP is very far now from having a majority in the public opinion. And even the alliance between AKP and MHP is not at 50%. It's not even at 48%. It's way, way, way below. So ramping up the nationalist narrative, rallying around the flag, is something that was important last year, remains important today.
I'm going to ask you a question that I wouldn't ask just anyone because, well, here's the question. The question is Turkey's very profound engagement, both in the war itself and since then in its efforts to continue to be a part of whatever situation on the ground, is that a good thing for the path to peace? And the reason I say I wouldn't ask just anybody is because on the surface, of course, you know, a regional hegemon, their participation can only be a good thing. But given what we know about Turkey's nationalist policies, given what we know about the interdependence with Azerbaijan, given what we know about Armenia's and Armenians' huge hesitation to have Turkey as a partner on the other side again. What do you think?
Well, first of all, the fact that Turkey went into this war in a rather massive way, of course they didn't send tanks, but a lot of advisors, a couple of planes, and above all, a lot of drones. This was, if you want, a sort of moment of opportunity for Ankara, in the sense that the Western world was completely busy, if not overwhelmed, by the pandemic. Legally, the calculus was probably made that Russia would not intervene because the security treaty between Russia and Armenia doesn't cover territory outside Armenia. Azerbaijan probably also made the calculus that having both Turkish drones and Israeli drones would give a huge tactical advantage. And also the assessment was probably made also, at least that's an assessment I would have made myself at the beginning of the war, that the Armenian army was not equipped to resist this new technique of war with the massive usage of drones and electronic warfare. A lot of what we have seen on television is traditional combat posture from the Armenian army, which I would say goes back to the Soviet era. Heavy tanks, fixed positions, the ground troops in fixed positions. So this is, of course, a traditional way of making war, but it's not at all adapted to resist this new technique. And if one followed, the war in Idlib or the war around Tripoli, when Turkey decided to defend the government of national accord, it was obvious that there was a new methodology, a new technique at work there, and the imbalance was huge. Luckily, the war came to an end, but it was a very asymmetric kind of war. And I think the moment of opportunity was seized by Turkey to the advantage of Azerbaijan, obviously, but also to score a point in the domestic political debate.
So again, the path to peace, is Turkey's presence a positive or a complex uncertainty? And this will be my last question about Turkey, because I really want to talk about the European Union.
Sure. It is a complex issue in the sense that unless Turkey becomes a little more involved in multilateral peace agreements, we've seen in the past year and a half, be it on Syria, be it on Libya, be it on maritime boundaries in the Eastern Med or Nagorno-Karabakh, is an aggressive, assertive foreign policy accompanied by military involvement. In the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, it's the extreme example with a major conflict and a victory for Azerbaijan. So inevitably, Turkey will want to play a role in the next phase, but that is going to be complicated.
Will Azerbaijan want Turkey to play that role?
They might, but more importantly, will Russia want Turkey to play a major role? I mean, we've seen that, of course, Russia, for reasons that we know, intervened late, but in a way, brokered a ceasefire. Now, the question is the role of Turkey in monitoring the ceasefire, and Turkey has much higher ambitions than Russia is visibly prepared to give it. So that's a first issue. And then, of course, when you come to the peace agreement, well, you'll have to deal with the status of the Nagorno-Karabakh people and the guarantees for them. I'm talking of NK proper. Then the protection of the Lachin corridor, which is vital, of course. And then the Megre corridor, in which Turkey is most interested. But that is completely uncharted territory for the moment. My short answer to your question is yes, this is going to be a very complex negotiation.
I said that was my last Turkey question, but it isn't. Given that you continue to research and work in this area, not just Turkey, but also the Middle East, the Turkey-Iran tandem, in this case, are there opposing interests, or can they come to some sort of acceptance of the other's, if not role, because Iran doesn't have a role, but it certainly has interests?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to see how the relationship between Turkey and Iran develops about Syria, because that is where the main interaction is, and it is far from simple, as we all know. This triangle, Russia, Iran, Turkey, is in many ways, again, an opportunistic move, but it is extremely complicated to manage. Then, coming back to Nagorno-Karabakh, I don't think Iran would ever want to see its relationship and its physical access to Armenia hampered by the Megre corridor. So, of course, Iran is not a part of the ceasefire agreement, but at one point, if you want a peace agreement, it has to move to the multilateral stage. And there, you're going to see a lot of people. You're going to see the UN, maybe the Minsk group will be back, but the US will be there, Russia will be there, of course, Turkey will be there, and I would assume Iran will want to be there.
We should mention, for those who aren't familiar, the Megre corridor that you keep referring to is the aspirational route that Turkey and Azerbaijan would like to establish, and which, according to the ceasefire document, is to be established in some form, in some way, through Syunik, through or near Megre, or possibly farther north, in order to allow direct land access from Turkey through Nakhchivan to Armenia, through Armenia to Azerbaijan, which of course is hugely problematic for many people, Iran, and of course Georgia, as we heard in in a previous
Yeah.
conversation. Ambassador, the European Union, you know that throughout the war and even after the war and continuing, the expectation not just of Armenians, we're speaking about Karabakh and Armenia, but in any of these other very complex battles, the constituents, the victims, the citizens of the country in question look to the European Union because they believe in the values and therefore expect that the European Union will somehow be able to offer some sort of meaningful something. I hesitate to use the word support, but intervene in some way, something. What was the European Union's track record? What do you think about it, and what can realistically be expected?
Well, I left the EU diplomatic service 8.5 years ago. So I lived through the inception years of the Lisbon Treaty applied to foreign policy, the creation of the external service, the new role of the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, etc. I have to say that despite all the good words, the treaty and so on, and all the effort, and certainly the efforts of the current High Representative Josep Borrell, we haven't gone very far, to be quite honest. We have a lot of declarations, but we always had declarations. I mean, remember Javier Solana 15 years ago or more. So, declaratory diplomacy is fine, but it was fine 15 or 20 years ago. It doesn't mean much today with the autocratic tendencies in so many countries. So if you look at the hotspots of the world today, whether you look at very far from where we sit in Brussels to Myanmar, or if you look much closer to Syria, to Libya, Armenia, Azerbaijan, or even Ukraine, or Belarus, well, you're not seeing a very forceful European Union diplomacy.
To say the least.
To say the least. The mantra is, of course, there. So never again a conflict. We have done that for ourselves, from the Schuman Declaration of 1950 all the way through all the treaties. Fine. So we cannot have another war between ourselves. Fine. And, for me, it's important as a baby boomer with so many in my family, my father, my uncle, my great uncle in Verdun, and so on. It is an achievement. But we haven't done the next salt, the next step, if you want, which is to be heard as a power. Borrell, when he was confirmed in the European Parliament, he had a very appropriate formula, I think. He said, we need to learn the language of power. Yeah, he's absolutely right, because just repeating the never again mantra is by far not enough. I mean, it's almost irrelevant, if you want. Especially, it was irrelevant in the past 4 years under the Trump presidency, of course, which, seen from Europe, was a kind of earthquake. There was a kind of autocratic president in a country which is supposed to be our ally anywhere in the world. So we're not there by far. We have a lot of disputes within institutions, but we have mostly one very big problem, which is that when the Lisbon Treaty was created, it was, in a way, an initiative by the big three at the time, Germany, UK, and France. Now the big three are two, to say, well, diplomacy is a serious thing. We're not going to leave that to technicians, unelected people in Brussels. We will repatriate it to, and which is, in a way, if you want, speaking as a Frenchman, a Gaullian attitude. De Gaulle was, in words, very pro-European, but in fact, what he meant is that I will give you a solution and you will follow me, follow my lead. So that doesn't work anymore. And that thing has not been understood yet, neither in Paris, neither in Berlin.
But it's also, partly at least, because there is an assumption at the very foundation of the European Union that the interlocutor, even if that is outside of the European Union, that there is some level of sharing of aspirations and respect for values, particularly human rights, in some shared common way. And as a result, the reliance on sovereignty as the red line that the European Union, for example, or the United States, or Russia, theoretically can't pass because you're dealing with a sovereign state, while at the same time, the power within that sovereign state is being used against its own citizens. Now, obviously, I'm speaking about Karabakh and the people of Karabakh, which Azerbaijan says are its citizens, but really what I'm saying applies to so many of these situations, Syria glaringly. How does, and not just with your former European Union hat on, but how do we do this? Because the world over, this is the problem, that those with the right approach and values and respect for human rights are also those who have chosen not to exercise the power that they have because they respect a concept that the other side, this other country, isn't respecting, as evidenced by their actions.
Yeah, I would say that we are in maybe a new beginning, in the sense that, again, seen from Brussels, and someone who's worked in conjunction with U.S. ambassadors everywhere I was, we've seen a massive split, transatlantic gap during the Trump presidency. Therefore, there was almost no possibility, at least zero predictability, in any discussion of what do we do about Syria, what do we do about Russia, and so on, because everything that European leaders would expect from an American president and would discuss with the American administration, be it the Pentagon or the State Department, would be ultimately contradicted by the president. Okay, that was an immense shock, and that shock started literally 3 months into the Trump presidency in the first NATO summit he came to in Brussels. If you remember the statement by Angela Merkel, she said, well, now for the defense of Europe, we are on our own. Well, that is over, thankfully, but they still have to reinvent a new formula to work together. In that sense, the principled approach that, to me at least, the Biden-Harris presidency has shown so far, either internally with George Floyd, or externally with Navalny, or now with Armenia, or the Armenian Remembrance Day, well, that at least puts back on the table a clear convergence of minds between Washington and most European states. Of course, you're going to tell me that Europe is a bit fragile on that front, because you have Orban, you have the Visegrad Group, more generally, you have Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. Yes, we do. But I think the assessment that you find now in the European Parliament, in the Bundestag, in the French Assemblée Nationale, is that principles matter, democracy matters, rule of law matters. And I was, for example, only a couple of days ago, on Monday afternoon, I was following the debate in the plenary of the European Parliament about Turkey. The beginning was about the Sofagate, forget about that. And the next step was, what do we do with Turkey? And you've moved very clearly, not just in the European Parliament, but importantly in the Bundestag as well, from a situation where, well, yes, principles are important, but we have to do trade and investment and so on with Turkey. So let's put that aside, the principles, rule of law, and we'll do the customs union. Hey, no, it doesn't work. The Bundestag is up in arms against that, and the European Parliament as well, including a number of deputies from Angela Merkel's party. So it means that because of, this new awareness of these issues, because of the fact that across Europe, the Greens are the new Social Democrats, if you want, to use a short formula, you're going to have a different debate. And who knows, you may not even have a CDU chancellor in Germany next September.
Ambassador, if we bring this full circle, considering this is the last episode of the series that is called After War, Before Peace, and if this is going to be my last question of the last episode, given the complexities that you've described beautifully, and I know that many of our listeners would have wished for much more direct, solution, 1, 2, 3 answers, but the reality is this is the international community within which we're working. So given all of that, what leverage or room for, what is Armenians, not Armenia's, but Armenians' agency in this process in order to be able to live peacefully within a world where all of the values that you've just mentioned are in fact supported by these global, well, the hegemons, European Union. So that's question one. Question two is, even outside of the European Union considerations, what likely path to peace in that region that takes in consideration the fact that the European Union and the United States probably are not going to be these very present, hands-on participants? And if that's an unfair assumption, you'll tell me.
No, not necessarily. But yeah, you can have doubts about the European Union. I think, in a way, the European Union is going to be prompted by the Biden-Harris presidency.
So the leverage is here in the United States.
Sorry. Yeah.
So the leverage is here in the United States.
Yeah, the leverage is in the US, and the leverage in the EU is essentially, do we want to talk about rule of law, democracy, and what else for eternity without acting, or do we want to be acting in a meaningful way? So, you have several tests, very different ones. You have, we've discussed that briefly, you have Libya. Libya, as I wrote a few months ago, is a European emergency. It's on our doorstep. We procure oil and gas from there. It's one of the main routes of irregular migrants to Europe. And are we going to sit there watching Russia and Turkey oppose each other? No, we can't. So we're going to have to be back in that game. And similarly, for Armenia, I think, because Armenians are important in so many different member states, and remember, I was born and raised in Marseille, so I know what Armenians abroad are, and it's unavoidable that because of the weight Armenians have in so many different countries, because principles are so clearly at stake in the peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in my view, it's inevitable that the European Union be involved. Whether that will be to the liking of Turkey, well, maybe not. To the liking of Russia, we'll see. But in any case, a peace agreement will have to be blessed at a very minimum, if not engineered at multilateral level, and this is where the EU will have to come back.
Ambassador, that's a great closing line. I'm grateful to you for your time and for your thoughts and for the very both pragmatic and also hopeful analysis. Thank you, Ambassador Marc Pierini, and thank you to all of you who have been following this series. I suspect looking for answers that we probably have not provided, because I'm not sure the answers are there. At this point, it seems to me the questions have to be the right questions, and questions in a context that is a real take on the real region and the real world and all of the interests that must be taken into account as everyone searches for a path to peace. We at the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies will continue to study these questions, research these topics, and share them with you. We ask that you continue to follow the information that is there so that, in fact, the approach to this continuing conflict is one that is based in reality, but at the same time aspires for peace. Thank you for following this series, After War, Before Peace. No.